This video is meant to help you work your way through the Africans in America assignment. This is something that's probably going to take you a couple of days to get through. So you just want to pace yourself and make sure that you have it done by Friday. That's the goal, so that we can keep on track. The goal at the end of this is to create a project that shows what slavery was like, among other things, but that's really what you're going to be learning in this part of the project. So I'm giving you this PBS link, which is at the top of your document. You can see I'm doing a split screen here, but you can click on the hyperlink if you want to go to the website. You can just watch this video because I'm going to read through each of these parts, but I'm just going to do one part at a time. That way, if you don't really need all of them, you can just watch the video for the parts that you need. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that part 1 says terrible transformation. That's the part that I'm going to be reading. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total questions from that part, from part 1. Within each part, there are multiple articles. And so I have a separate column that says article name. The first one is just your prior knowledge. Why did American colonists begin importing slaves? And that's something that really you should already know, because we have touched on it a little bit already, and I think you learned about it in prior years of your schooling. But basically it was to work on plantations that were over here in the Western Hemisphere, whether it was in the Caribbean or in what later became the United States. So that would be your answer to number 1. They're mostly working on plantations. And the whole point of that is to make a profit, because you don't pay slaves. They work for free. And so once you purchase the slave, the idea is then the rest of it's just going to be profit. So that's going to take us to the next article, or the first one really, which is called African Slave Trade in the Middle Passage. Over here on the left, I'll show you how to navigate the website. You can do it at the top. Those cursive titles that you see in cursive writing are clickable, but you can also scroll down to the bottom in the red section, and you can click on things from there as well. As you'll notice from the instructions that I highlighted on the Word document, it says after opening each category, click on narrative to reveal the articles. If I go straight down to the red section, I can see narrative there, and I can just click directly on that. So I'm going to go to part 1, terrible transformation, and click on the narrative. Every time you open up one of the narratives for each part, it has an introduction, and sometimes those are very helpful. So I'm going to read this introduction, and then I will take you to the first article. It says the years 1450 to 1750 brought enormous changes to the North American continent. The Native Americans, or Indians as the Europeans came to call them, first encountered European explorers, and before long saw their world transformed and largely destroyed by European settlers. And European explorers not only ventured to the lands and natural wealth of the Americas, they also traveled to Africa, where they began a transatlantic slave trade that would bring millions of Africans to the Americas as well. This slave trade would, over time, lead to a new social and economic system, one where the color of one's skin could determine whether he or she might live as a free citizen or be enslaved for life. So that's the background. And now I'm going to go to African slave trade and the Middle Passage. At the bottom here, you'll see the links. Those are your article names. All right, so as I read this, I am looking for answers to the questions that are listed on my document. So I'm going to look at those questions before I actually read, and that way I know what I'm reading for. Number 2, it says, what did Europeans trade for slaves? Number 3, describe a captive's experience immediately upon capture. Number 4, what body of water did the Middle Passage cross? Number 5, how long did the Middle Passage usually take? Number 6, upon arrival in the Americas and the Caribbean, Europeans sold their captives. What did they purchase with the money they received, and why? Number 7, describe the experiences of the captives in the slave ships. Give at least 4 examples. specific examples of their environment. So we're looking for the answers to those 6 questions, 2 through 7, over here. You know what? I'm gonna do this so that you can see what I'm talking about. All right, this is the article I'm reading now, and these are the questions that we're trying to answer. So you can have your document up and ready to go, and when you hear me read a part that you think answers one of those questions, you could press pause and type or write an answer into your document. All right, here we go. It starts out by saying, this African chant mourns the loss of Olaudah Equiano, an 11-year-old boy and son of an African tribal leader who was kidnapped in 1755 from his home in what is now Nigeria. He was one of 10 to 12 million Africans who were sold into slavery from the 15th through the 19th centuries. Quote, I believe there are few events in my life that have not happened to many, wrote Equiano in his autobiography. The many he refers to are the Africans, taken as free people and then forced into slavery in South America, the Caribbean, and North America. Along the west coast of Africa, from the Cameroons in the south to Senegal in the north, Europeans built some 60 forts that served as trading posts. European sailors seeking riches brought rum, cloth, guns, and other goods to these posts and traded them for human beings. So if you want to press pause at this point, that was your answer for number 2. What did Europeans trade for slaves? I'm going to keep reading. You could press pause if you want to put that answer in now. This human cargo was transported across the Atlantic Ocean and sold to New World slave owners who bought slaves to work their crops. European traders such as Nicholas Owen waited at these forts for slaves. African traders transported slaves from the interior of Africa. Equiano and others found themselves sold and traded more than once, often in slave markets. African merchants, the poor, royalty, anyone could be abducted in the raids and wars that were undertaken by Africans to secure slaves that they could trade. The slave trade devastated African life. Culture and traditions were torn asunder as families, especially young men, were abducted. Guns were introduced, and slave raids and even wars increased. After kidnapping potential slaves, merchants forced them to walk in slave caravans to the European coastal forts, sometimes as far as 1,000 miles. Shackled and underfed, only half the people survived these death marches. Those too sick or weary to keep up were often killed or left to die. Those who reached the coastal forts were put into underground dungeons where they would stay, sometimes for as long as a year, until they were boarded on ships. So I feel like some of that answers number 3, a captive's experience immediately upon capture. I'm going to keep going now, and we'll look for the answer to number 4, what body of water did the Middle Passage cross? Just as horrifying as these death marches was the Middle Passage, as it was called, the transport of slaves across the Atlantic. And that's your answer there for number 4. On the first leg of their trip, slave traders delivered goods from European ports to West African ones. On the middle leg, ship captains such as John Newton, who later became a foe of slavery, loaded their then empty holds with slaves and transported them to the Americas and the Caribbean. A typical Atlantic crossing took 60 to 90 days, but some lasted up to 4 months. That was the answer to number 5. Upon arrival, captains sold the slaves and purchased raw materials to be brought back to Europe on the last leg of the trip. Roughly 54,000 voyages were made by Europeans to buy and sell slaves. I just read the answer to number 6 as well. So now we're on number 7, which asks you to describe the experiences of the captives on the slave ships. Give at least 4 specific examples of their environment. So what was it like? I'm going to read this really big, bold caption here that says, slaves packed like cargo between decks often had to lie in each other's feces, urine, and blood. Africans were often treated like cattle during the crossing. On the slave ships, people were stuffed between decks in spaces too low for standing. The heat was often unbearable and the air nearly unbreathable. Women were often used sexually. Men were often chained in pairs, shackled wrist to wrist or ankle to ankle. People were crowded together, usually forced to lie on their backs with their heads between the legs of others. This meant they often had to lie in each other's feces, urine, and in the case of dysentery, even blood. In such cramped quarters, diseases such as smallpox and yellow fever spread like wildfire. The diseased were sometimes thrown overboard to prevent wholesale epidemics. Because a small crew had to control so many, cruel measures such as iron muzzles and whippings were used to control slaves. Over the centuries, between 1 and 2 million persons died in the crossing. This meant that the living were often chained to the dead until ship surgeons, such as Alexander Falconbridge, had the corpses thrown overboard. While ships were still close to shore, insurrections of desperate slaves sometimes broke out. Many went mad in these barbaric conditions. Others chose to jump to their watery deaths rather than endure. Equiano wrote of his passage, "Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much happier than myself." All right, that was pretty heavy stuff, and you should have been able to get the information you needed to answer all of the questions so far through number 7. The next article for part 1 is the growth of slavery in North America. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and this will give us the answer to number 8. It says to list the specific freedoms that were taken away from slaves. Slavery became a highly profitable system for white plantation owners in the colonial South. In South Carolina, successful slave owners, such as the Middleton family from Barbados, established a system of full-blown Caribbean-style slavery. The Middletons settled on land near Charleston, Carolina's main port and slave trading capital. They took advantage of the fact that at the end of the 17th century, some of the earliest African arrivals had shown English settlers how rice could be grown in the swampy coastal environment. With cheap and permanent workers available in the form of slaves, plantation owners realized this strange new crop could make them rich. As rice boomed, landowners found the need to import more African slaves to clear the swamps where the rice was grown and to cultivate the crop. Many of the Africans knew how to grow and cultivate the crop, which was alien to Europeans. By 1710, scarcely 15 years after rice came to Carolina, Africans began to outnumber Europeans in South Carolina. Slavery was rapidly becoming an entrenched institution in American society, but it took brutal force to impose this sort of mass exploitation upon once free people. As Equiano wrote, white and black lived together in a state of war. The more harshly whites enforced racial enslavement, the more they came to fear black uprisings. As they became more fearful, they responded by further tightening the screws of oppression. Here's a quote by a historian. He said, "If you're a white authority, you're constantly trying to figure out how tightly you want to impose the lid with respect to people running away. How fierce should the punishments be? Should it be a whipping? Should it be the loss of a finger or a hand or a foot? Should it be wearing shackles perpetually?" Carolina authorities developed laws to keep the African American population under control. Whipping, branding, dismembering, castrating, or killing a slave were legal under many circumstances. Freedom of movement to assemble at a funeral, to earn money, even to learn to read and write, became outlawed. All right, that was your answer for number 8, by the way. I'm going to keep reading. At times, the cruelty seemed almost casual. A Virginia slave owner's journal entry for April 17, 1709 reads, Anaka was whipped yesterday for stealing the rum and filling the bottle up with water. I said my prayers and I danced my dance. Eugene was whipped again for pissing in bed and Jenny for concealing it. White fears of the people they kept enslaved were entirely justified. On September 9th, 1739, an African man named Jemmy, thought to be of Angolan origin, led a march from Stono near Charleston toward Florida and what he believed would be freedom on Spanish soil. Other slaves joined Jemmy, and their numbers grew to nearly 100. Jemmy and his companions killed dozens of whites on their way in what became known as the Stono Rebellion. White colonists caught up with the rebels and executed those whom they managed to capture. The severed heads of the rebels were left on mileposts on the side of the road as a warning to others. White fear of blacks was also rampant in New York City, which had a density of slaves nearing that of Charleston. In 1741, fires were ignited all over New York, including one at the governor's mansion. In witch hunt fashion, 160 blacks and at least a dozen working-class whites were accused of conspiring against the city of New York. 31 Africans were killed, 13 were burned at the stake, 4 whites were hung. A few white men, although in the minority, balked at the cruelty toward African slaves. Francis Lejeune, an Anglican minister who oversaw a church built on land donated by the Middletons, spoke against the cruelty of Carolina slavery. Samuel Sewall, a Boston judge, wrote a pamphlet called The Selling of Joseph, criticizing slavery. Georgia, the last free colony, legalized slavery in 1750. That meant slavery was now legal in each of the 13 British colonies that would soon become the United States. But the conflict between those who supported racial enslavement and those who believed in freedom was only just beginning. In the tumultuous generation of the American Revolution, protests against enslavement by Britain and demands for American liberty would become common in the rebellious colonies, and many African Americans, both slave and free, had high hopes that the rhetoric of independence would apply to them. These hopes, however, would eventually be dashed, and it would take a bloody civil war 3 generations later to finally bring an end to the enslavement of Black Americans. All right, that completes part 1. There was a lot of information in there that you did not need to answer these questions, but I still wanted to read it because it's really important information and it'll help you in creating your projects. If you need to do part 2 with me, that will be in a separate video.